The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 11. The Reason as Governor of Life. But even the man who is capable of governing his life by ideas, who recognizes, that is to say, that it ought to express clearly conceived truths and principles of his being, or of all being, and tries to find out or to know from others what these are, is not often capable of the highest, the free and disinterested use of his rational mind. As others are subject to the tyranny of their interests, prejudices, instincts, or passions, so he is subjected to the tyranny of ideas. Indeed, he turns these ideas into interests, obscures them with his prejudices and passions, and is unable to think freely about them, unable to distinguish their limits, or the relation to them of other, different, and opposite ideas, and the equal right of these also to existence. Thus, as we constantly see, individuals, masses of men, whole generations are carried away by certain ethical, religious, aesthetic, political ideas, or a set of ideas, espouse them with passion, pursue them as interests, seek to make them a system and lasting rule of life, and are swept away in the drive of their action, and do not really use the free and disinterested reason for the right knowledge of existence, and for its right and sane government. The ideas are, to a certain extent, fulfilled. They triumph for a time, but their very success brings disappointment and disillusionment. This happens, first, because they can only succeed by compromises and pacts with the inferior, irrational life of man, which diminish their validity and tarnish their light and glory. Often, indeed, their triumph is convicted of unreality, and doubt and disillusionment fall on the faith and enthusiasm which brought victory to their side. But even were it not so, the ideas themselves are partial and insufficient. Not only have they a very partial triumph, but if their success were complete, it would still disappoint, because they are not the whole truth of life, and therefore cannot securely govern and perfect life. Life escapes from the formulas and systems which our reason labors to impose on it. It proclaims itself too complex, too full of infinite potentialities, to be tyrannized over by the arbitrary intellect of man. This is the cause why all human systems have failed in the end, for they have never been anything but a partial and confused application of reason to life. Moreover, even where they have been most clear and rational, these systems have pretended that their ideas were the whole truth of life, and tried so to apply them. This they could not be, and life in the end has broken or undermined them, and passed on to its own large, incalculable movement. Mankind, thus using its reason as an aid, and justification for its interests and passions, thus obeying the drive of a partial, a mixed and imperfect rationality towards action, thus striving to govern the complex totalities of life by partial truths, has stumbled on from experiment to experiment, always believing that it is about to grasp the crown, always finding that it has fulfilled as yet little or nothing of what it has to accomplish. Compelled by nature to apply reason to life, yet possessing only a partial rationality, limited in itself, and confused by the siege of the lower members, it could do nothing else. For the limited, imperfect human reason has no self-sufficient light of its own. It is obliged to proceed by observation, by experiment, by action, through errors and stumblings to a larger experience. But behind all this continuity of failure, there has persisted a faith that the reason of man would end in triumphing over its difficulties, that it would purify and enlarge itself, become sufficient to its work, and at last subject rebellious life to its control. For, apart from the stumbling action of the world, there has been a labor of the individual thinker in man, and this has achieved a higher quality and risen to a loftier and clearer atmosphere above the general human thought levels. Here there has been the work of a reason that seeks always after knowledge, and strives patiently to find out truth for itself, without bias, without the interference of distorting interests, to study everything, to analyze everything, to know the principle and process of everything. Philosophy, science, learning, the reasoned arts, all the age-long labor of the critical reason in man, have been the result of this effort. In the modern era, under the impulsion of science, this effort assumed enormous proportions and claimed for a time to examine successfully and lay down finally the true principle and the sufficient rule of process, not only for all the activities of nature, but for all the activities of man. It has done great things, but it has not been, in the end, a success. The human mind is beginning to perceive that it has left the heart of almost every problem untouched, and illumined only outsides and a certain range of processes. There has been a great and ordered classification and mechanization, a great discovery and practical result of increasing knowledge, but only on the physical surface of things. Vast abysses of truth lie below, in which are concealed the real springs, the mysterious powers, and secretly decisive influences of existence. It is a question whether the intellectual reason will ever be able to give us an adequate account of these deeper and greater things, or subject them to the intelligent will, as it has succeeded in explaining and canalizing though still imperfectly, yet with much show of triumphant result, the forces of physical nature. But these other powers are much larger, subtler, deeper down, more hidden, elusive, and variable than those of physical nature. The whole difficulty of the reason in trying to govern our existence is that because of its own inherent limitations, it is unable to deal with life in its complexity or in its integral movements. It is compelled to break it up into parts, to make more or less artificial classifications, to build systems with limited data which are contradicted, upset, or have to be continually modified by other data, to work out a selection of regulated potentialities, which is broken down by the bursting of a new wave of yet unregulated potentialities. It would almost appear even that there are two worlds, the world of ideas proper to the intellect, and the world of life, which escapes from the full control of the reason, and that to bridge adequately the gulf between these two domains is beyond the power and province of the reason and the intelligent will. It would seem that these can only create either a series of more or less empirical compromises, or else a series of arbitrary and practically inapplicable or only partially applicable systems. The reason of man struggling with life becomes either an empiric or a doctrinaire. Reason can indeed make itself a mere servant of life. It can limit itself to the work the average normal man demands from it, content to furnish means and justifications for the interests, passions, prejudices of man, and clothe them with a misleading garb of rationality, or at most supply them with their own secure and enlightened order, or with rules of caution and self-restraint sufficient to prevent their more egregious stumbles and most unpleasant consequences. But this is obviously to abdicate its throne or its highest office, and to betray the hope with which man set forth on his journey. It may again determine to found itself securely on the facts of life, disinterestedly indeed, that is to say, with a dispassionate, critical observation of its principles and processes, but with a prudent resolve not to venture too much forward into the unknown, or elevate itself far beyond the immediate realities of our apparent or phenomenal existence. But here again it abdicates. Either it becomes a mere critic and observer, or else, so far as it tries to lay down laws, it does so within very narrow limits of immediate potentiality, and it renounces man's drift towards higher possibilities, his saving gift of idealism. In this limited use of the reason, subjected to the rule of an immediate, an apparent vital and physical practicality, man cannot rest long satisfied, for his nature pushes him towards the heights. It demands a constant effort of self-transcendence and the impulsion towards things unachieved and even immediately impossible. On the other hand, when it attempts a higher action, reason separates itself from life. Its very attempt at a disinterested and dispassionate knowledge carries it to an elevation where it loses hold of that other knowledge which our instincts and impulses carry within themselves, and which, however imperfect, obscure, and limited, is still a hidden action of the universal knowledge will, inherent in existence, that creates and directs all things according to their nature. True, even science and philosophy are never entirely dispassionate and disinterested. They fall into subjection to the tyranny of their own ideas, their partial systems, their hasty generalizations, and by the innate drive of man towards practice, they seek to impose these upon the life. But even so, they enter into a world either of abstract ideas, or of ideals, or of rigid laws, from which the complexity of life escapes. The idealist, the thinker, the philosopher, the poet and artist, even the moralist, all those who live much in ideas, when they come to grapple at close quarters with practical life, seem to find themselves something at a loss, and are constantly defeated in their endeavor to govern life by their ideas. They exercise a powerful influence, but it is, indirectly, more by throwing their ideas into life, which does with them what the secret will in it chooses, than by a direct and successfully ordered action. Not that the pure empiric, the practical man, really succeeds any better by his direct action, for that too is taken by the secret will in life, and turned to quite other ends than the practical man had intended. On the contrary, ideals and idealists are necessary. Ideals are the savor and sap of life. Idealists, the most powerful diviners and assistants of its purposes. But reduce your ideal to a system, and it at once begins to fail. Apply your general laws and fixed ideas systematically, as the doctrinaire would do, and life very soon breaks through, or writhes out of their hold, or transforms your system, even while it nominally exists, into something the originator would not recognize and would repudiate, perhaps as the very contradiction of the principles which he sought to eternize. The root of the difficulty is this, that at the very basis of all our life and existence, internal and external, there is something on which the intellect can never lay a controlling hold. The absolute, the infinite. Behind everything in life there is an absolute, which that thing is seeking after in its own way. Everything finite is striving to express an infinite, which it feels to be its real truth. Moreover, it is not only each class, each type, each tendency in nature that is thus compelled to strive after its own secret truth in its own way, but each individual brings in his own variations. Thus, there is not only an absolute, an infinite in itself, which governs its own expression in many forms and tendencies, but there is also a principle of infinite potentiality and variation, quite baffling to the reasoning intelligence. For the reason deals successfully only with the settled and the finite. In man, this difficulty reaches its acme. For not only is mankind unlimited in potentiality, not only is each of its powers and tendencies seeking after its own absolute in its own way, and therefore naturally restless under any rigid control by the reason, but in each man their degrees, methods, combinations vary. Each man belongs not only to the common humanity, but to the infinite in himself, and is therefore unique. It is because this is the reality of our existence, that the intellectual reason and the intelligent will cannot deal with life as its sovereign, even though they may be at present our supreme instruments, and may have been in our evolution supremely important and helpful. The reason can govern, but only as a minister, imperfectly, or as a general arbiter and giver of suggestions which are not really supreme commands, or as one channel of the sovereign authority, because that hidden power acts at present not directly, but through many agents and messengers. The real sovereign is another than the reasoning intelligence. Man's impulse to be free, master of nature in himself and his environment, cannot be really fulfilled until his self-consciousness has grown beyond the rational mentality, become aware of the true sovereign, and either identified itself with him or entered into constant communion with his supreme will and knowledge.